Hi, welcome back to Not So Obvious Watches and my follow-up to my video on how Omega could hunt down Rolex should they choose to. Why do I do these follow-ups? Sometimes when I get really great comments in response to a video, I feel it's a shame to just sort of bury my reply in the comments field. I think it's better that I sort of elevate it and get it out there for everyone to see. That's what I'm doing today. This is going to be me responding to your comments to that video. So with that intro done, I'll see you on the other side. So as I said, this is my response to your comments. This video could go longer than I want, so I'll just leap straight in. The first comment comes from Blue Shirt Buddha, who said that if Omega tries to replace Rolex, it won't work because Rolex is Coke and Omega will always be Pepsi in that fight. And I could not agree more. I totally agree. In fact, that's the entire premise of my video. I think I said a couple of times, Omega cannot out Rolex. They cannot replace Rolex. The strategy is, if Rolex is Coke, Omega needs to be coffee. If Rolex can always give you a cola drink, Omega wants to be giving you a cappuccino in the morning, a flat white in the afternoon, an espresso in the evening, and then an affogato at night. That's what Omega is trying to do. They have, and they can have, so much more breadth, so much more depth than Rolex. They don't want to replace Rolex. They want to surpass Rolex. They want to be so much more than Rolex can ever be. That is their path to success. In a sense, this really brings me into Hort Time's comment where he said that really what Omega needs to do is find, for example, an alternative to the Submariner. And what they need to do is treat their great watches like icons, like Rolex does. And I think that is a recipe for losing. That is dragging you into that fight of being Pepsi to Rolex's Coke. That is just trying to out Rolex. And if you try and do that, you will lose. This is kind of how, at the meta level, at the very highest level, where I'm coming from here. So Rolex, we estimate, sells 750 to 900,000 watches a year. We know that the single most commonly sold Rolex is a Lady Datejust. It is estimated across the industry that about 25% of Rolex's production are the highly sought after steel sports models that we're all talking about, that form the basis of Rolex's larger appeal. Take the numbers and shrink that down, so take that 250,000 and spread them across all the steel sports watches. That would mean it's likely that Rolex sells maybe 40,000 Submariners a year. Now, if I'm Omega, that is a pissy, piddling little number that I want to blow out of the water. I want to be selling 100,000 Seamasters a year, 150,000 Seamasters a year. I don't want to be selling a measly 40,000. I want to be way more than that. How do I get there? It's by not doing the sorts of things Hort Time was talking about, which is to produce a mere alternative to a Submariner. I want to be way more than that. And to do that, I can't treat my watches with kid gloves. I can't baby them. I can't lock them away and say the design will never change. What I want is the guy who wants a Submariner to buy the bloody Submariner. Buy it, enjoy it, love it. It'll never change. You never need to buy another one. Great. Fantastic. So buy your Submariner. And then 2 years later, when you want something else, keep your Submariner because it won't have changed. Buy a Seamaster. And then 2 or 3 years after that, when you still want something else, you still don't need to buy the Submariner because the Submariner still hasn't changed. So now buy a James Bond Seamaster. And then 3 or 4 years after that, when the Rolex still hasn't changed and there's still no reason to buy anything other than a Submariner, buy the latest Olympic Seamaster or the whole next version of the Seamaster, the one that's completely different to anything we have now. That is how Omega passes Rolex. Let Rolex lock themselves into their 700,000 watches a year. You want to do way more business than that. That is how you get ahead. Which really neatly brings me down to Marcus's point below about saying that I've kind of mischaracterized the fight. I said it was about sort of trying to get on top, selling watches and being on top. And he was saying actually the real name of the game is selling watches and surviving. Now, I actually kind of agree with that. And so this is, as I say, a thought experiment. And so it's like playing Monopoly. Unless we agree that we are playing the game, there's not a whole lot of point with whatever comes next. So the game we're playing is how could Omega get on top of Rolex? That said, in today's world, I'm not sure if getting on top or at least competing for market leadership and survival are actually all that different. The way, and Marcus refers to this himself in his comment, the way social media works and the way that the winner is massively over rewarded with this sort of hype train that further boosts you is such that if you fall too far behind and that hype train, that the elastic snaps, it doesn't matter how careful you are, you could be headed for oblivion. So I think that for a company like Omega, within a group like Swatch, which only makes watches, trying to compete for the leadership is kind of the same as trying to compete to survive. And so I don't think this is necessarily a totally moot point. I would also say that I did have the idea of not betting the farm, of not potentially risking everything, as Omega did way back in the 70s. I did have that on my mind as I kind of went through the strategies. First off, it's why I gave Omega 10 to 15 years. Don't have to make any big muscle movements quickly. You can take small steps and test and adjust as you go. Secondly, I didn't advocate anything that requires significant capital investment. Omega historically seems to have had the capacity to make over 1 million watches a year. I haven't heard of any huge divestments, so I'm guessing that they actually have capacity they're not using. So they can certainly expand production and probably expand quality without having to make big new capital investments that carry long-term liabilities. I have said that they should upgrade their marketing and probably just spend more. But the beauty of that is, again, that does not incur long-term liabilities. You can spend more on marketing this year, and if it's not working or if you need to make savings, you can simply turn that off. Not relying on borrowings, and you don't have to pay a lot of interest on those borrowings with respect to marketing campaigns. Marcus made the point that Omega needs to improve their quality if they want to compete with Rolex. Totally agree. I don't think, as I said in my previous video, I don't think Omega needs to compete directly with Rolex. They're not trying to be Rolex. They're trying to be something different, something more. But I do agree that they need to take steps to improve quality, to just get rid of the noise. I'd be perfectly happy if people went, you know what, at the end of the day, Rolex's is a little bit better, but Omega's perfectly fine. That's probably all Omega needs to aim for. The next 2 points Marcus made I would probably disagree with. The first one was about the motivations of Rolex and why they don't change their watches. I believe Marcus kind of repeated a myth in the industry, that there's some high-minded reason for why Rolex doesn't change their iconic watches, but instead just focuses on improving the reliability. They profess that this is like for us. They're doing us a favor. And I call bullshit on that. I see that Rolex's strategy, and I spoke about this in a completely different video, Rolex's strategy isn't some high-minded helping us be the best versions of ourselves. Rolex's strategy is a kind of PTSD-driven reaction to barely surviving the quartz crisis and seeing that playing constant defense, in soccer terms, parking the bus and just defending your own goal, worked great for them. And so that's all they do. They've just kept parking, they've kept that bus parked, they've got all their players pulled back, defending their goal, and that's it. So, like I said, I don't disagree with the fact that Rolex treats its watches all like icons, doesn't change the design, and just messes with the internals. Where I disagree is on the motivation. I see that there is nothing high-minded about it. It is purely a response to their ultimately defensive strategy about protecting the hill they're on and not seeking to grow. And the final point that Marcus made, and which I would disagree with vehemently, is Tudor's long-term growth potential. I think Tudor has as much chance as an ice cream dog chasing an asbestos cat through hell of getting to like a Rolex kind of place. Tudor is the rock star's little brother. They're the best, not quite so good looking friend of the captain of the football team. That has got them invited to a number of parties and has given them a profile that their actual catalogue and their actual watches don't really justify. That's jumped them up a long way, and they will do okay out of that. But I see nothing in Tudor's current catalogue. I see nothing in their design direction, and I certainly see zero in their history that tells me they have the kind of substance required to become someone who sells 10, 15, 20% of the Swiss watch industry every year. I just can't see it happening. Bruce the Man Lee made an interesting point, and again, one of these ones I half agree with, where he said that no company is ever going to be able to chase down Rolex because all the other companies take a very short-term view, whereas Rolex takes a very long-term view. I half agree with you there because you're right. By being a foundation, by being a so-called charity, Rolex doesn't have kind of the same motivations, the same pressures that the other groups have. However, I think if you look at, and so the idea that these other watch groups, and Swatch in particular, is going to be a quarter by quarter profit and dividend driven company would seem to make sense. Unfortunately, if you do, what I would say, from my point of view, I would say if you look back at their history, Swatch haven't really acted that way. The very formation of Swatch in the first instance was a strategic activity. Ever since then, they have, whether you look at how they've treated their ETA movements, how they've treated their brands, the decisions they've made along the way, have all been quite strategic. Swatch only makes watches. They have no business, they have no desire, they've not evidenced no kind of motivation to become a real estate company or to sell everything up and go into finance. If you look at their board structures, the people on the board are still family members with the people who created Swatch in the first place. So do they have the same sort of really long-term vision of Rolex? No, they're probably not. But I do think it's a misreading of the industry to think that Swatch acts like some tech startup out of San Francisco, trying to maximize next year's profits so that they can make next quarter's profits so that they can make a sale and claim a dividend. So I like I said, I do kind of agree with your direction there, but I think you're overstating it. I don't think that there's that much difference between Rolex and Swatch in this area. Okay, so the next point was really interesting. It was raised by Scott C., who really challenged the basis of my whole argument. My argument was that the king of the hill, the holder of the throne, the wearer of the crown for the Swiss watch industry is very simple. It's not based on style. It's not based on kudos or respect. It's simply who brings in the most Swiss francs a year. And Scott challenged that by saying, so does that mean that if Swatch, the company, not the group, got there by selling $1 billion $50 watches, does that mean they're the king? And I would say, yes, they are. Noting that that's a topsy-turvy world where the whole basis of the Swatch industry, the Swiss industry, has changed. What I would say is, in that world, what effectively happened is Switzerland would have become China. China has great brands. China has people that make very expensive watches. We have no idea who they are, and we don't care who they are because they're characterized really by the fact that their predominant export is cheap and cheerful stuff that gets used by other people. and the king of the Chinese watch industry would be the one who simply shifts the most of those. Were Switzerland to change and become similar to China, then yes, the brand that brought in the most Swiss francs because they sold a billion $50 watches wins the competition. That said, I think it's kind of a thought experiment, not a real event, because it's never going to happen. The next question or point came from Stuster, I think I'd say, and he went to a level of detail I didn't really go to. Really now looking inside, I looked at the structure of the Omega catalogue, but I didn't really look inside that at the kinds of watches they were selling. Stuster went there, and you know what? I'd largely agree with him. He made the point that as well as catalogue changes and everything, Omega needs to make more watches available at different sizes, make smaller watches available. And I totally agree. I don't think that means compromising and starting to just produce 40mm divers and hope that fits everyone. I would say go smaller again and maybe sell 37, 38mm divers and 42mm divers. Maybe make a 36 and a 39, 40 and a 43 or something like that. The name of the game is have a watch for everyone, not to bend people to your will and make them wear a watch that's too small or too big because that's all you can be bothered selling them, which is what a lot of companies are doing right now. Stuster also made the point about getting rid of what we would call in football terms list cloggers, those watches which do clog up the inventory but don't sell. Now, he was particularly talking here about, for example, chronograph divers. And I agree. If you go to Chronext or those sorts of secondhand places, or sorry, grey outlets, what you will find is the single most common and most discounted watch is often the Seamaster chronograph. You can find these brand spanking new, box and papers, all the stickers intact, 40% off, advertised. You don't even have to negotiate for that. That tells you that watch is a stinker. I'm going to jump completely to another brand. I'm going to talk about Breitling here. Breitling famously have done similar things for years. It's kind of why their reputation is what it is. But I've been watching them closely over the last few years, and you'll notice there's none of that happening. That you don't see a lot of new build Breitlings turning up at marked 40+% discounts. The other thing you'll notice if you watch their catalog really closely is that those stinkers, the ones that aren't selling, are gone. They're not there. I've counted about 20 or 30 watches that have been introduced within the last 4 or 5 years that are now gone from the catalog. Sometimes it's just sizes and colors, sometimes it's particular combinations, but yeah, they're just gone. And more importantly, they're not turning up on the grey market. They're just vanishing. What I suspect they're doing is Breitling is holding a really tight rein on production, inventory, distribution, and then final sale. And they're not overproducing stinkers that can't be shifted. They're watching that really carefully. As I said, they haven't done it in the past, but they're doing it now. That is the kind of discipline Omega needs. Try different things, put lots of stuff into the market, but don't produce 100,000 of them hoping they all sell, and when they don't, dump them to Chronext and Joma Shop. Bleed them into the market. As I said earlier in my video, it's always better to have a bit of a wait list than to overproduce. Come up with a new watch, underproduce it, sell out, have a 6-month wait list, but tell people it's coming. That is far better than to overproduce and dump. And unfortunately, that's kind of been Omega's strategy in the past. Second last question, Jeb raised the point that across the board, the numbers are a little bit skewed because the pandemic has kind of hit Swatch's bottom end brands pretty hard. And as a result, we're probably getting an unrealistic idea of just how big Rolex is within the Swiss watch industry. That's probably true. I think when we move from 2020 into a more normal 2021, 2022, as Tissot, Mito, Hamilton, and those lesser brands from Swatch kind of recover and get some foot traffic again, those numbers will come up and the Swatch and the Rolex numbers will come down. So I agree with that point. However, Jeb also made the point that the real game is actually Swatch Group versus Rolex. And from a corporate balance sheet point of view, I can make that argument. But from a real world social media hype train point of view, I don't think that's true. That kind of misses the point. The reason why Rolex has burst free of the pack is because their name, their single name, that single brand has created a community and a hype rocket ship that no one else can touch. What happens with Swatch is their community, their hype, their coverage is diluted across lots of brands, and that elastic has snapped and a Rolex has shot to the fore. My whole idea is what Swatch Group needs to do is pick a winner, concentrate on that, drive them up to and potentially past Rolex, grab that air, and then from there they can then distribute community, largesse, marketing to their lesser brands. But while as a group they're all sort of squabbling amongst each other, they're simply allowing Rolex to rocket ahead. So I suppose what I would say is, unless Swatch do pick a winner, and I think the only obvious choice there is Omega, to chase Rolex, then Rolex is simply going to keep pulling away from Swatch overall. The final point was actually answering a number of you that asked me to do similar kinds of analyses on how other brands could potentially make the same move. I'm not going to do that. No other brand is in a position where they can launch an attack on Rolex. Not now, not in 10 years, probably not for 20 years. I say that because a couple of things. One, within the Swatch Group, Omega is the only brand that's really in the right place. It has got the right demographics to make that leap forward. If you do look at the other groups, Richemont, LVMH, and Kering Group, watches are only a tiny part of those groups, particularly for LVMH and Kering. And Kering is a really interesting one in particular because we don't talk about them, but as a group, they dwarf Rolex, they dwarf Swatch. For them, watches aren't the main game. And in that environment, I'd be stunned if they even want to make that press. The sorts of existential threat that, say, Swatch might exist from becoming an also-ran doesn't really apply to Richemont, LVMH, or Kering Group brands because they're protected within a much larger luxury brand that has a lot more flexibility. So I'm not going to do another video on any other brand having a launch at this. That said, that doesn't mean brands like JLC are actually achieving all that they can, and I will do some videos on how I think they could improve their performance, but it's certainly not going to be looking at how they could reach for the brass ring and take the throne. Okay, so that's really it. They're all my responses to your comments. Now, I do not do follow-ups to follow-ups. So this will be the last time I talk about this topic, at least for another year. Next year, hopefully some more Morgan & Stanley results will come out. The industry may have settled a little bit more. There could be some changes. So next year, I'll revisit this and see where I am. But for the time being, this is it. If you want to leave comments, please do. I invite you to. I will still read all of them. And if they raise interesting things for me to look at, maybe next year or in a different light, I will certainly go that way. I've been Pete McConville. This has been Not So Obvious Watches. Please like and subscribe to the channel, and I'll see you later. Bye.